Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And this week we were sitting down to start a new series of podcasts talking about how to grow your Copilot in your personality. We're planning this out, and as we were planning out, we thought, well, the CAR model, what we talk about here a lot at Personality Hacker, is so important for that. Let's make sure we know which podcast we talked about the CAR model, and let's make sure we reference it on this short series of podcasts that we're getting ready to record. And as we were searching through our website and some of our podcasts, we realized that we actually have never dedicated an entire podcast talking about the framework that we use all the time here at Personality Hacker, which we've called the CAR model. Now, we have articles on the CAR model. We've got a couple, graphics on our website about the CAR model. We even have a lot of podcasts talking about it when we talk about all the individual types. So if you look back through the catalog of a lot of podcasts, when you find your personality type, let's say INTJ, for example, we talk about INTJs in the framework of the CAR model, but we don't have a high level, structural conversation around the CAR model itself and how it applies to all types. And so we thought we'd take some time today before we kick off this short series to go back and make sure you're caught up in case you're a new listener and you've never heard about the CAR model before, or if you've been here for a while and you've heard us allude to it, but you've never done your due diligence to go look it up on personalityhacker.com and get the information you need to understand what we're talking about. This podcast is intended to be a great reference point for you to understand what we're talking about when we talk about the CAR model. The reason why this model is so powerful and useful is it does something that we talked about, I believe it was 2 episodes ago, where we talked about this idea of horizontal models or ways of seeing the world, which are, assuming everyone's at the same level of health or growth, there are ways to distinguish people from each other. So like the Myers-Briggs system, there's 16 variations of personality. We're not saying one is better than another, or that, INTJs are more growth focused than ESFPs, for example. Everybody is who they are individually, and these are ways to describe people on a horizontal model or lateral, the flavor that people show up with, the personality type and flavor they show up with. And then we talked about this idea of vertical models, which are models like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which build upon themselves. So at the bottom of Maslow, for example, you have survival, and the next level up is safety, security, love and belongingness, self-esteem, and self-actualization. Not that one of these is better than another, but they build upon each other. You can't work on your love and belongingness needs unless you've got your survival and safety, security needs met. So that's a vertical model. And you can see the difference between those just in a general overview of the two styles. And in that same podcast, we talked about, it emerged in the conversation where we talked about how we at Personality Hacker tend to inject vertical models of growth into horizontal models of understanding. So if you find out that on a horizontal model you are an INTJ, we have a tendency here at Personality Hacker to want to find out ways to put vertical growth to you being an INTJ. And this is where we come back all the way to the CAR model. We believe the CAR model is a great framework for you, whatever your personality type is, even if you're not an INTJ, to find aspects of the CAR model where you can find growth paths for yourself. You can find ways to grow yourself using your own personality type. Find ways to augment your personality, to use your strengths, to help minimize or use or work with your weaknesses. There's all sorts of ways to use this model for growth. We think it's a powerful model, and we'd love to get into this today and talk about some of the frameworks so that when we go into the next series of podcasts on how to use it for growth, it'll make sense to you and you'll have a reference point.
Right. So the CAR model itself is not in and of itself vertical. It's a metaphor to understand what in the Myers-Briggs system is generally called technically called a cognitive function stack. Now, before we launch into the CAR model, we should probably explain what a cognitive function is, if the CAR model is a metaphor for stack.
Good idea.
Yeah. So in the Myers-Briggs system, which originally was intended to build on the work of Carl Jung, who invented or pattern recognized these different mental processes that different archetypes use. And that was the birthplace of these 8 cognitive functions. They were in and of themselves individual personality types. And then later on, the work of Carl Jung was taken by Isabel Briggs Myers and Catherine Briggs, and they created the Myers-Briggs system, which is a way to sort of codify how 16 different personalities engage with these 8 cognitive functions. The 8 cognitive functions are mental processes that every single person uses to both take in new information, or what's called perceive information, and then determine the value of that information, or what's technically called judge it. And if you're already seeing patterns between the idea of judging functions and perceiving functions, along with the 4-letter code where at the end of each Myers-Briggs type there's a J and a P, you are pattern recognizing something correct. There is a correlation, but it's not a one-to-one, which is why sometimes this gets really technical and complicated, because the same language is being used to describe slightly different things. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. But in the meantime, you've got 8 different mental processes that all human beings use and have access to. 4 of them are judging or evaluative cognitive functions, and 4 of them are perceiving or information gathering cognitive functions. The 4 different judging functions are related to thinking and feeling. There are different ways of evaluating information that depend upon whether or not you favor a thinking process or a feeling process. And then when you dive a little closer into that, or fillet that out a little bit more, there are 2 styles of thinking, judging functions, and 2 styles of feeling, judging functions. So the 2 styles of thinking functions are called introverted thinking and extroverted thinking. So the thinking part stays the same, but the direction it's pointed, or what's technically called an attitude, either goes outward in extroverted thinking or is turned inward in introverted thinking. The same applies for feeling. There are 2 styles of feeling judging or evaluative processing. One is extroverted feeling, and the other one is introverted feeling, and it's the same pattern. It either goes outward or it goes inward. But the overview of each stays approximately the same. For thinking evaluations, the evaluative criteria is more impersonal. It's how things like resources are impacted and data points, and people become one node in the system or one thing that should be taken into consideration, but it's not the whole complete picture. Whereas with feeling judging functions, people make up the majority of the evaluative criteria, as in how is this going to impact individual people, either myself or others. Whereas thinking, again, is a little bit more impersonal and takes in more factors than just the human component. So that creates 4 judging functions: introverted thinking, extroverted thinking, introverted feeling, extroverted feeling. So those are again, as I mentioned, judging functions. And when we say judging, we mean evaluative. They don't just take information in impartially. They are looking for the decision that must be made from this evaluative criteria, meaning how should the world be? What should be happening? Because when we take action, we are impelled by should statements. If I'm going to take an action, it means that's the action I should be taking. So think of it as like judging. You're judging a situation. Is it good or bad? Is it the thing that should be happening? How will people be affected? How will time be affected and resources be affected? Well, if it's going to be affected this way, then we should do this thing. So think of judging functions as the shouldness of something. On the other side, you have the perceiving processes, and there's 4 of those. And these are attached to sensing and intuition. There, again, the pattern falls the same as with the judging functions. The intuitive and sensing processes or functions are also split into 2 different styles of attitudes. If you are a sensor, you could be using either introverted sensing or extroverted sensing as your primary way of information gathering. And if you are an intuitive, you could be using introverted intuition or extroverted intuition as your primary way of taking in information. Again, just like with thinking and feeling, there is a very similar set of criteria of what captures your attention, because our perceiving processes inform the kinds of things that interest us. What are we going to be looking at? Kind of think of this as the illustration of the blind men with the elephant. There are different parts of the elephant that each of the blind men are engaged with, and so they're describing the elephant very differently depending upon what part of the body they're touching. If it's an ear, it's a big flat, floppy thing. And if it's a trunk, it's like a long, hard, bendy thing. And the same applies, if it's a leg, it's a trunk-like thing. And so all of these blind men are touching a different portion of the elephant, and they're all describing the same thing, but they're describing the different access points to the elephant that they currently are engaged with. And that's kind of how perceiving processes work. For people who have 4 different perceiving processes as their favorite, or functions as their favorite way of engaging with the world, might be looking at the exact same thing, but describing very different elements of it because different elements are capturing their attention or are personally interested to them. And so perceiving process is more about information gathering, but information gathering based on what captures us. So for sensors, it is information that is reliable and verifiable, and that can be verified and relied upon with their different sensing processes, or more than just the 5. You usually think of like the 5 primary senses, but this can go beyond those. There's lots of different types of senses. There's like a sense of, time and balance and other elements. But sensors primarily rely on those instruments, the body's instruments, and what kind of conclusions they'll draw depends on whether or not they are using extroverted sensing or introverted sensing. Same thing with intuition or intuitives. They like their intuitive perceiving process more than their sensory one, so they have a tendency to focus on those things as their information gathering tool. Intuition is about, it could be encapsulated to advanced pattern recognition or kind of imagining what's going on behind a curtain, which cannot be directly engaged with. So therefore they have to pattern recognize what can be directly engaged with and then project or speculate what's happening beyond what can be personally experienced. But how they do that is different depending upon whether or not they're using introverted intuition or extroverted intuition. Now, we have done podcasts on the difference between these different perceiving processes. So my recommendation is to go back and listen to the podcasts on all of these different cognitive functions. We did compare contrast podcasts on extroverted and introverted intuition, extroverted and introverted sensing. That one's called the sensing personality types. We also did podcasts on extroverted thinking versus introverted thinking and extroverted feeling versus introverted feeling. So we go into a much deeper dive on what all of these 8 functions look like. And I recommend going and checking those out. However, the point of all of this is that is what 8 cognitive functions are. And then the CAR model helps you understand which of these functions you have a preference for and which ones you're going to, just kind of you're naturally wired to gravitate towards. Which of the judging functions is your favorite go-to way of projecting a should into the world, and which of these perceiving processes is your favorite thing to pay attention to and your favorite way of engaging with the world and information gathering. Once you figure out or fillet out how to determine your 4 functions from your personality type, that's when you can place them in that cognitive function stack, or what we call the CAR model.
I want to take a quick timeout moment here just to point out 2 quick things. And we're going to get into the actual CAR model and the structure of that in a moment. But realize that you're going to use a mixture of these cognitive functions that Antonia just spoke about. You're going to have a mixture of some of the introverted versions and some of the extroverted versions of these cognitive functions. And let's say you are an INTJ listening. That INTJ, that 4-letter code, is very dichotomous in nature, right? It says you're either an introvert or an extrovert, right? You're either an intuitive or a sensor, and it's supposed to be very dichotomous, almost like a toggle switch. You're one or the other. And often this is where people give a lot of pushback to the Myers-Briggs system. You might watch videos online that says Myers-Briggs is BS because it pigeonholed people into being one thing or another. They're either an introvert or an extrovert. And that can't be the case because we all have introverted and extroverted parts of us. So this is all BS. And there's some truth to what they say is we can't be all introverted or extroverted. So they're correct on that front. But without a fundamental understanding of what that 4-letter code means and the cognitive functions that it's pointing to, it's almost like a decoder ring to give you the functions you're using and then the priority of the functions you're using. We all have an introvert part of us and we all have an extrovert part of us. So this idea of like an ambivert, we are all ambiverts because we have all of these parts of us. We all have introverted parts and extroverted parts. So without a fundamental understanding of cognitive functions, it's very easy to hear about the dichotomies, that 4-letter code, and then call BS on the entire system from lack of understanding. And a lot of smart people don't know about cognitive functions, and then they make some patterns and start to say, oh, well, this can't be true because this, introvert and extrovert is a gradient. We have all of them in us. And they're right, we do. And they don't understand the system. So when you go out there and you see a lot of these dissenting views on the Myers-Briggs system, Often it's from people that have a little bit of information, but they don't have the full and complete picture of what we're actually doing with the system. So understanding this is going to give you the ability to really understand the system as it was designed to be understood and used. And that's why the CAR model is so powerful, because you're going to have a sense of, oh, I see how my personality has much more fidelity. There's much more nuance to how I'm wired. There's a lot more going on here than just a simple 4-letter code. I see how this is, and you're going to have a tremendous amount of power to understand yourself. And then when we get into talking about how to grow yourself in the next few series of podcasts, you're going to understand why that makes sense and why you put focus on the different growth parts of who you are. Because there's a part of you that we want to focus on initially to begin growing that cognitive function or that process in you that will give you the biggest bang for your buck, the biggest return on investment of putting the time in to grow that aspect of your personality.
Yeah, and I think that segues great into the next thing that you have to understand before you can really, figure out what your cognitive function stack is for your personality type. And that is that all humans have to do 4 different things. They all need access to 4 different components of their personality. They need a way to get outer world feedback or to extrovert, right? Engage with the outer world and have a way of sort of figuring out who they are in contrast to how the world experiences them and how to engage with other people and to be a social creature and to also, recognize that they have impact in the world. So all of us have an extroverted part of who we are. And everybody needs to have an introverted part of who they are. They have to have a way to get inside of themselves and ask introspective questions, understand identity and who they are internally and what means something to them and what their personal evaluation is, not just how they've been influenced to evaluate. And so we all need both of these things. We also, all of us, need a way to take in information, and we need a way to determine the value of that information. And so what's nice about understanding your 2 favorite cognitive functions is that you actually end up having all 4 of those things represented, because each of the functions is introverted or extroverted, and each of the functions is either perceiving or information gathering, as well as judging or evaluative. And so when you get 2 of these processes or functions, you knock out all 4 as long as you have a judging and a perceiving and an introverted and extroverted process. So one of the great things about understanding the CAR model is to determine of those 4 things, we still have a tendency to gravitate towards, of those 4 things, a couple of them, but we also have a way to balance ourselves out. And that's why the Copilot is so important. The Copilot process is because it gives us the ability to make up for the 2 elements that we still need in our personality, but might be a blind spot since the driver can only get 2 of those 4. So we all need an introverted or extroverted judging process. And in contrast, we need a perceiving process that will be the opposite attitude of that initial process. Okay, so that's really complicated. So let's break that down. If I am an ENTP, that means that my dominant cognitive function or my driver process, which we'll talk a little bit about the role of the driver in a moment, but that means that my favorite mental process is extroverted intuition. Well, extroversion is one of the things that I have a need for. And I also need a way to take in information. So great, I've got 2 of those things represented with extroverted intuition. But now I have 2 elements of my personality that are missing, because extroverted intuition can't help me it can't help me judge information because it's intuition, it's perceiving, it's information gathering. And it also doesn't give me any access to my internal world because it's extroverted. It's a way to get outer world feedback and make impact in the world and engage with it. So I have to balance it with an introverted judging function, which I do as an ENTP with a process called introverted thinking. And you, Joel, as an ENFP, have the same dominant or driver process. You also use extroverted intuition. But as an ENFP, you're going to balance it with introverted feeling. So that's where our personality types differ, is that we're still using the same driver or dominant cognitive function, but we are balancing it with 2 different functions that operate very differently. I'm using introverted thinking, you're using introverted feeling. Now, as ENPs, our judging process can never be an extroverted process. We can't be using extroverted thinking or extroverted feeling as our primary way of engaging with the world, because that doesn't give us an introverted access point. That actually would make us pathologically extroverted. And we need a way to engage with our internal world. So that's kind of how the formula works. If you are leading with an extroverted perceiving process, extroverted sensing or extroverted intuition, you must balance it with an introverted judging function, introverted feeling or introverted thinking. The same pattern follows if you're leading with an extroverted judging function. If you are leading with extroverted feeling or extroverted thinking, you must have an introverted perceiving process, which would be introverted intuition or introverted sensing. And then it flips. If you're an introvert, it means you lead with an introverted process. And if you lead with introverted intuition or introverted sensing, then that means you must balance it out with an extroverted judging function, extroverted thinking or extroverted feeling. And if you are leading with an introverted judging function, introverted thinking or introverted feeling, you must balance it out with an extroverted perceiving process, extroverted sensing or extroverted intuition. I know that probably sounds like a lot. If you've never heard this before, that sounds like a lot. However, all it's attempting to express is that there's a reason why certain functions, cognitive functions, are paired together. That's really the point. The point is that they're paired together because they allow us to accomplish those 4 criteria. We have a way to engage with the outer world and a way to engage with the inner world. And we have a way to gather new information as well as determine the value of that information. So a lot of people ask, why are they paired the way that they are? And that is the answer, is because we have those 4 things that we require, and each function can only do 2 of the 4. And so therefore, we must pair that function with another function that will give us access to the 2 things that we need as humans, but that the function we lead with will not give us access to.
So probably as you're listening, if this is the first time you've heard this or you've heard it somewhere before and you're trying to figure this out, it can be overwhelming. This is not necessarily, in other words, if you're having struggle following what Antonia just said, what I've said earlier on in this podcast, that's probably normal. Like most people struggle with understanding some of the nuance of this, because you might be going, okay, I'm an INFP, and they said I need introverted, extroverted, so I'm an introvert. Does that mean, and I've got intuition, does that mean that's an introverted intuition, extrovert? Like, how do I figure all this out? We're not necessarily going to go through each type on this episode to show you how to figure out which cognitive functions you're using. We have an entire series of podcasts we recorded for each of the 16 personality types. If you go back into our catalog and you find, for example, the INFP podcast, we'll break down which functions you're using in which order on this car model. In this episode, we want to talk about the car model structure itself outside of your particular type. And it's just another way to frame all the information. It's a place to hang these cognitive functions, or put these cognitive functions of that metaphor, to understand your relationship with them holistically, or our relationship with them on all personality types. So it's not specific to your type in this episode. We have episodes that will help you make that jump or that connection point for you specifically. So again, if you're having some like, wow, I'm overwhelmed by all that information, don't worry. Don't like try to be notes and figure it out right now. This is not designed for that piece to make the connection for you. We're just going to give you a framework here, and then you can listen to your particular type podcast to get more nuance about you and your personality.
Right. One more thing that you have to understand about how cognitive functions work before you can truly understand the car model or your 4-function stack is that each of these cognitive functions has a polar opposite. So there are 8 of them, but imagine that 4 of them are actually polar opposites of the other 4. And we call these polarities. So the polarities are important to understand why you have some cognitive functions in your stack that are less sophisticated. Why do we have to have strengths and weaknesses? Well, it's because when you're paying attention to one side of the polarity, you are by definition not paying attention to the other half. And what we pay attention to and feed and nourish and grow, that ends up being one of our strengths. And then its polar opposite doesn't get attention. It doesn't get fed. It doesn't get nourished. And so therefore it has a tendency to diminish. It's just it's an example of the cost of specialization. So recognizing which of these functions that you are the most drawn toward based on your wiring and your personality type also lets you know what are your blind spots or the elements of your mind, because you have access to all of these functions. But there are going to be some that are not given as much attention simply because they are not being given as much attention because the opposite of them is way more fun for you. And so the polarities help you determine which are your strengths and then concurrently which are your weaknesses. So the 4 polarities are these. And if you want to take notes on this, please feel free. But this will help you understand why you have a 10-year-old and a 3-year-old in the car model when we get to that point. So the polarities are, on the perceiving side, extroverted intuition and introverted sensing. They make up a polarity of each other. That means that where one is present, the other one is always also present, but in a diminished capacity. The other perceiving polarity is introverted intuition and extroverted sensing. On the judging side, the polarities are extroverted feeling and introverted thinking. Again, wherever one is present, the other is also present, but in a diminished or stronger or less strong capacity. And then the final polarity is introverted feeling and extroverted thinking. So if one is present in your stack and you have it as a strength, just assume that the other element of the polarity is in your personality stack, but as a weakness.
One way to imagine this is like a seesaw. And the seesaw is that polarity. On one side, you have one cognitive function. On the other side, you have the other cognitive function. And the seesaw comes intact. It can't come with half the seesaw. The balancing of that. So you're going to have, and imagine the one cognitive function is heavier and pulling the seesaw down. It's weighted more. It's got more influence in your life. And the other one's lighter. It doesn't have as much influence to tip the scales in that direction. But the seesaw itself comes as one unit in your personality.
So now you have all the information you need to understand how to create a cognitive function stack. Your personality type is wired to favor a single cognitive function, and that is what is technically called your dominant cognitive function. It is your go-to function or go-to tool in your toolbox. Each of the 16 Myers-Briggs personality types has a different dominant cognitive function that they favor. And then in order to be a complete person, because that dominant function can only supply 2 of the 4 human needs, which again are introversion, extroversion, and judging or evaluation, and perceiving or information gathering. Since that dominant function can only supply 2 of those 4 needs, you must have another cognitive function that balances you out. And that is technically called your auxiliary function. I'm struggling with the word technically. So I'm going to probably mess that up since I'm going to have to say it about 20 more times in this podcast. Okay.
It's all good.
All right. So now you have a dominant function and an auxiliary function that give you all 4 of those human needs. Understanding the polarities is how you recognize what your descending order of functions are in strength. So your auxiliary process and the polarity opposite of that auxiliary process is what makes up what is technically called your tertiary function. So your tertiary function is going to be the polarity opposite of your auxiliary. And then at the bottom of the 4-function stack is something that is technically called your inferior function. And your inferior function is the polarity opposite of your dominant.
You can already see why we use a car model. We haven't even introduced the car model yet in the framework, and we've introduced it, the idea, but you can see why we've placed it here because we're talking about dominance and auxiliaries and polarities and all these things that are attached. It starts to get very confusing if you have to look at this almost like a 1 to 4, a stack downward, because you have to guess which things are tied to other things. And so the car model that we're going to get ready to talk about next is going to get you a really clear way to place these in your personality, making it easier to understand how you interface with these functions.
Right. So let's hop into that car model because now we understand all the technical building blocks for a person's functions. Let's use a very easy metaphor so that you can get a picture, like you mentioned, Joel, in your mind of how this works. So imagine your mind is a 4-passenger vehicle. And in the front of the vehicle is a driver, and then sitting next to the driver is a co-pilot. Sitting behind the co-pilot is a 10-year-old, and sitting behind the driver is a 3-year-old. These are your 4 functions as represented in a car. So your dominant function we use a driver as a metaphor. And that kind of makes sense, right? Your driver or dominant process is going to be what you put in charge most of the time. The driver process is, we also kind of affectionately call it the flow state, because people love being in their driver or their dominant process. It actually is what regenerates your batteries. And this is why sometimes people have some confusion over whether or not they're an introvert or an extrovert. Not all introverted activities regenerate the batteries of every introverted personality type. And it's because it's not just introverted activities that regenerate your batteries. It's specifically introverted activities that appeal to your dominant or driver function. So not all introverted activities are created the same. And so therefore, if you are an introvert, but you're doing a bunch of introverted stuff, and you're not doing introverted stuff that appeal to your driver process, then you actually won't get the benefits of energy recharge from these other activities, because they're not nourishing and feeding specifically that driver process. And the same thing happens with extroverts. Not all extroverted activities are the same. Extroverted activities appeal to the 4 different extroverted functions differently. And so if you're doing a bunch of extroverted activity, but none of it's moving the needle for you and it's not regenerative, it's probably because you are not feeding and nourishing your specific extroverted function. And so really, it isn't introversion or extroversion that regenerates us. It is introverted or extroverted activities that appeal to that driver process. And so people get confused. They're like, I'm an extrovert, but I like to spend a lot of time at home. It's like, well, which extroverted function are you using? And are you doing extroverted activities that are specific to that function? And the same thing applies for introverts. All right, so your driver function for your personality type is your flow state. It is the thing that recharges your batteries. And we use the word flow, borrowed from the concept of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who wrote the book Flow. And there are certain qualifiers that determine if an activity is a flow activity for you. But a couple of them are things like you lose time when you're doing this activity because it's so enjoyable. Another one is that it is an activity that is a little outside. It's challenging, so it's a little outside your current level of development, but no, not so challenging that it is demoralizing. And we have a tendency as people to set up conditions in our world to keep us challenged in our driver process because it is so enjoyable for us. And if we can't do that, then we find ourselves getting low energy. We find ourselves getting a little dysthymic with life and bored with life because our driver process or function isn't being challenged. And that is where we find some of our greatest joy and pleasure in life, is appealing to that driver process. People don't know this, and especially if they don't understand personality types, but if you ask them to describe themselves, they will unconsciously spend about 80% of their time describing this driver process.
That's a good point. In our profiler training course, when we train people how to do live profiling with people, that's one of the things we really focus on. Is one of the first questions we ask is a question to get people engaged in that driver process. Because when you're determining someone's type, if you can get them talking about that driver process, a wealth of information will come out about their personality type. You'll understand, oh, that's probably the process they're driving with. Because quite often when you ask them about flow, what puts them in flow or what gives them regenerative energy, they often, like you said, Antonia, 80% of the time will talk about that process. So paying attention to that is also used in typing when we help train people how to type better.
Right. We are very identified with this driver cognitive function. It's our dominant, right? That's its technical name is dominant. It is dominant over our minds and our lives and generally how we construct our life. So now, again, remember, this driver function is going to be either introverted or extroverted, and it's going to be either a judging process or a perceiving process. So it gives you 2 of the 4 things you need to be a complete person. And so once you know what your driver process is in your personality type, then it gives you few options to what the Copilot process is, because the Copilot process will then balance out the other 2 needs you have as a person.
Yeah, and I just want to make a quick comment about that driver process. Because it's so dominant, it's almost the lens that you enter the world with, whether it's perceiving or judging. It's so ubiquitous. It's so a part of your personality. It's so much of how you engage with the world. Oftentimes, in fact, in most cases, unless you've really studied this and understand this about yourself, it's unconscious. You don't even realize sometimes that this is how you're showing up to the world, because doesn't everyone show up to the world this way? That's almost how your mind is coding this way of engaging with the world. It's almost the way, it's like a fish in water. The water is everything to the fish, right? So this is that idea that you are entering the world with this dominant process, this driver process that is most likely unconscious for you. But now the Copilot, technically called the auxiliary function, that's sitting right next to the driver. This is a little more conscious. This is also a very significant part of your personality. Sometimes you can be in flow using this process, and sometimes you're not. It depends on the circumstance, but this isn't necessarily the way you organize your entire personality or the entire way you organize moving through the world. This is the supplemental or Copilot process in your cognitive function stack or in the car model. This is also balancing out what the driver does. So if the driver is extroverted, this Copilot is going to be introverted. If the driver is a decision-making function or a judging process, this is going to be a perceiving or learning function or process. So it's just going to basically be balancing out your personality. And this is something that, because it's conscious, because it's something that's different than your driver, has to be focused on accessing. It's something that we, again, can come up maybe in a slice of your life. You'll probably find this emerging in maybe 1 or 2 or 3 areas of your life in a pretty dominant way. But there's ways you can expand your Copilot to be able to be used and augment or develop your personality by using it. So what does that look like? Well, what it looks like is getting into exercises or ways to grow it. Almost imagine it like a muscle or a workout that you could do in your personality to begin engaging with the world to help round out just the over amplification of that driver process. Again, you're entering the world. Let's say you're an extrovert, your driver process is extroverted. You're going to have a tendency to be more extroverted in your engagements with the world. And so developing this Copilot allows you to access, for example, the introverted parts of you, the parts of you that maybe need strengthened. You're developing them so you have more balance in your life. And over time, if you put focus on this, you can achieve incredible things by growing this Copilot. And by the same token, if you're using a driver process that is introverted, that means the Copilot would be extroverted. And by doing extroverted exercises to grow that extroverted part of yourself, you're now balancing out. So you're not over amplifying the introverted parts of you. You have more balance in your life. You have more access to more things. You have access to rounding out your personality and showing up as the best version of yourself in that way too.
Yeah, imagine the Copilot has a map in its hand and it's a navigator. So it's not in control of where the vehicle is going, but it is very helpful for helping the driver navigate through the world, because the driver is going to be paying attention to how it's experiencing reality in real time. It's going to be dealing with the challenges that come up. And then the Copilot or the navigator can help access maybe a longer range, like maybe sort of figure out where the mile markers are coming up. And so these two together provide a very competent sort of duo. And one of the reasons why we keep talking about this Copilot as being a really important element, the biggest bang for your buck developmentally, is that we have a tendency to really like the world of our driver, the driver function's attitude. If it's extroverted, we really like the outer world feedback we get. We like to engage with the outside world. And if it's introverted, we really like going inside and having sort of our subjective take on reality. And so since the Copilot forces us into the attitude that isn't native to us, isn't as comfortable, we have a tendency to not listen to it or to marginalize it. And one of the things I notice is that when people are problem solving and they're in an active problem solving mode, they will pull on the Copilot like crazy. They want that auxiliary process in there or auxiliary function in there to be able to help problem solve and, to be the best version of themselves in that moment of solving a challenge. But if they're not actively in problem solving mode, we do have a tendency to marginalize that part of us. And so what ends up happening is that the Copilot, that no matter which function is in the Copilot position, it can do a lot of different things. Each cognitive function allows us to do quite a few different things. But if we're only using it in certain problem-solving modes, we might get really good at the auxiliary Copilot process in a couple different contexts, but we don't really explore its full range of abilities. And so we might even believe we're really good at the Copilot and that we've done a lot of exercising with it and not realize that it's kind of a one-trick pony for us. Like we only listen to it in certain contexts and we don't get its full benefits. So exercising the Copilot or growing it like a muscle, like you mentioned, Joel, means not just accessing it on a regular basis, but it actually means accessing it in a wide range of activities on a regular basis. And so then we do have not just, one adult in the car that has all these different facets to it, and then another adult that is a one-trick pony or a very two-dimensional character. We then are able to have two adults with a wide range of experience and ability to guide a lot of different contexts and circumstances, and have a lot of, elements of wisdom to bring to the table. Sometimes it's really nice to be able to bounce ideas off of another adult, to be able to bounce your ideas and consult with whether or not you made good decisions. It's really nice to have two people, two sets of eyes on a situation. And when you have a well-rounded, well-developed co-pilot, that's what you're doing. You're getting another set of eyes, not just limited to dimensional eyes, but another set of eyes on a situation to be able to add a lot of wisdom and understanding to all of the elements of life that you might be engaged in.
Now, remember we said each of these cognitive functions is almost like a seesaw, or it's tethered to its opposite, right? So almost imagine like the driver has a little attachment to it, and the co-pilot has a little attachment to it. And looking at the car model, imagine the driver as the adult driving the vehicle, the co-pilot as the adult in the car being the navigator or co-pilot of the journey. And there's and we use the metaphor of children in the back seat tethered to each one of them. So behind the co-pilot, let's talk about what's behind the co-pilot. There is a 10-year-old. Now, this is, again, metaphor. It's technically called the tertiary cognitive function. But in the car model, we call it the 10-year-old. And it's tethered to the co-pilot, meaning that it's the exact opposite of the co-pilot. So, for example, let's just say the co-pilot is extroverted feeling, would be the co-pilot. We've nicknamed that harmony. Right behind that would be a process at the 10-year-old position, opposite of extroverted feeling, which would be introverted thinking. We've nicknamed that accuracy. So it's very easy. Once you know your driver and your co-pilot, all you have to do to understand what is at the 10-year-old position is take that co-pilot and find the exact opposite cognitive function, and that is the function that lives at that 10-year-old level. Now, why do we say this is a 10-year-old behind the co-pilot? Because this process inside your personality is not as developed as the driver or the co-pilot. If those are the two adults sitting in the front seat of the car, at the 10-year-old position, this is about the development of a 10-year-old person, a 10-year-old child, right? And we have 10-year-olds in our lives. You probably met a 10-year-old. You were a 10-year-old at one point, and you kind of know that 10-year-olds are a little bit sophisticated in the world, more than a small child would be. They are starting to understand things about the world. They have a few tool sets, language and ways they move through the world that are starting to become very sophisticated. And sometimes 10-year-olds even have deep insights because they're emerging and they're growing and they're learning more about the world. All of a sudden, one day, your 10-year-old child, literal child, might say something to you. You're like, wow, that was really insightful. That was a really interesting way of seeing the world or understanding a decision or something. That's really well developed for a 10-year-old. But it's still a 10-year-old. It doesn't have the full range of sophistication that an adult would have. And so this part of your personality is about like a 10-year-old's development. It's got some wisdom, some knowledge, some insight, but it doesn't really have the development of an adult. And would you ever hand the wheel of your car to a 10-year-old child to drive a vehicle on the actual freeway? No, they don't have the level of experience, even if they can articulate things well, even if they're very smart, even if they have maybe some really developing decision-making abilities or understanding of the world. You wouldn't allow an actual 10-year-old to drive down the freeway going 65 miles an hour because they don't have the experience or the judgment or the development of an adult. So we don't hand the wheel to 10-year-olds. And appropriately in your personality, this part of yourself, this cognitive function, shouldn't be in control of the vehicle. This is a part of you that can be part of the journey and have a voice there, but shouldn't be relied upon for navigation or for driving.
One of the reasons why it's able to develop to a 10-year-old's age approximately is because it's the polar opposite or polarity opposite of the co-pilot. And you're not spending as much time in the co-pilot as you are in the driver. The driver is your go-to tool. Your co-pilot is something that you use at times, and unless you have a context in your life that requires you or encourages you to really develop it, you're actually going to rely on that 10-year-old process quite a bit. And one of the reasons why is because the driver is either introverted or extroverted. And then the co-pilot's going to be the opposite of that. So if your driver is, say, introverted, your co-pilot is going to be, by definition, extroverted. But then since the 10-year-old is the polar opposite of the co-pilot, it goes back to being whatever attitude is favored by the driver. So if you're an introvert, then your co-pilot process is extroverted. And then that means that the 10-year-old process is back to introverted. That means that it lives in the world that you naturally are wired to prefer. And so almost every single person of all 16 personality types has a tendency to like to rely on the 10-year-old a lot because it lives in the world of each personality type's preference. And this is why we have a tendency to get into what is called a loop, which is the driver or dominant process and the 10-year-old or tertiary process getting into cahoots with each other and marginalizing or kind of shoving out the co-pilot, which is in the world or attitude that is less comfortable for us. And we actually did a whole series on loops, that dominant or driver and 10-year-old tertiary loop that each personality type experiences and what it can look like. So if you want to go check that out, go look at the cognitive function dominant tertiary loop series of podcasts. All right, so this 10-year-old, again, it's going to be something that we have a tendency to want to develop because it's in the world that we are comfortable with, but it's not going to really grow beyond a 10-year-old level generally, and it really shouldn't because you should be focused on the co-pilot because that's the biggest bang for your buck developmentally. Now, granted, once you really develop the co-pilot, once that is at a very strong, well-exercised, well-honed level, and it's no longer a two-dimensional tool in your toolbox, but it's actually well-rounded, has lots of different contexts that it can come through for you, and you are very good at marrying your driver and co-pilot in order to get to the next level or wherever you want to go. That is at a time when you can start paying attention to the development of the 10-year-old. And usually what that looks like initially is not just developing the 10-year-old, but actually finding a really good balance or simpatico between the co-pilot and the 10-year-old, because they are polarities. And that means where one exists, the other one automatically exists. The balance between the two is a little bit difficult for some people to figure out. Have you ever seen a family where the kids rule the entire family, right? Maybe even the 10-year-old with its demands or with its ability to throw temper tantrums has a tendency to sort of control the dynamic of the entire family. That can happen in people's personality types too. The 10-year-old or tertiary process can, through demands and through temper tantrums, through fears and anxieties, it can become one of the most powerful voices in the entire function stack. So one of the things that a lot of people need to do in order to have a well-balanced personality type, and this is kind of how it turns into sort of a vertical model through growth and development, is recognizing the proper place of the 10-year-old process, which means that the driver and co-pilot can't be stopping all production in order to soothe the 10-year-old. In a healthy family, the 10-year-old recognizes its place. It knows that mom and dad, or whatever the configuration is of the parental guidance, that 10-year-old knows that they are in control, that the 10-year-old doesn't have to try to take control because the adults in its life are showing up for it. And they are the ones who are securing the perimeter, and they're the ones who are in charge and are in control of themselves and the situation. And then the 10-year-old gets to relax and then be a 10-year-old, which is a person who enjoys a lot of fun and play and has moments of weirdly enough, has moments of deep insight and wisdom. But nobody's relying on the 10-year-old to take it to the next level, right? Because the 10-year-old just can't do that. So a balance between the co-pilot and the 10-year-old is that the co-pilot is fully showing up as an adult, right? Not abdicating its responsibility, not allowing the 10-year-old to call the shots, to get in cahoots with the driver. The driver is not using the 10-year-old against the co-pilot when the co-pilot has wisdom the driver doesn't want to hear. They've got a really good working relationship. And so the balance between the co-pilot and 10-year-old usually looks like a very balanced, thriving relationship between an adult and a child. And then once that happens, then the 10-year-old can start developing and growing into more sophistication and age. but it should only happen after the Copilot is in a not only well-developed, but also in a good parental role with the 10-year-old.
So again, there's tethering, the two adults in the front seat. The Copilot has a tethered opposite or polarity opposite that comes along with it, and that's the 10-year-old. Well, the driver has the same. As an adult in the car, the driver also has a tethering. It brings along another function with it, which is the opposite of the driver. So if the driver is, again, let's say the driver is extroverted thinking, the 3-year-old behind the driver, and I'll explain why we call it a 3-year-old here in a moment, would be introverted feeling. So again, it's a tethering of opposites that come along almost like a seesaw. They are connected, and when you have one, you're always going to have the other. Now, in the 3-year-old position, if you notice the 10-year-old it's on the cusp of something. 10-year-olds are on the cusp of leaving childhood and entering young adulthood or the teenage years. And so sometimes they show up very much like a small child or a childlike qualities, and sometimes they peak or they spike into acting a little more mature, almost like a teenager would act. And really depending on the context, like a literal 10-year-old in the real world in your life, depending on the context and the experience they have, they will lean probably one way or the other. And sometimes if you have an actual 10-year-old in your life, it's maddening because some days they show up very childlike and you're like, what happened? Yesterday you showed up so mature. Why are you acting this way today? So it's a cusp time period in someone's life at 10 years old. Well, behind the driver sits a 3-year-old, which is also a cusp time period in someone's life, leaving the baby time period in life and entering into toddlerhood. So sometimes a 3-year-old acts very much like a little tiny infant, a baby, screaming, crying, throwing temper tantrums. And other times they demonstrate competencies of being able to walk and grab things and color or write and maybe engage with the world physically that surprise you. You're like, wow, you're a little more mature today. Yesterday you were screaming and throwing a temper tantrum. Today you're actually talking to me and engaging with me like a toddler would. So it's a cusp time period. So it's unpredictable in which way it's going to go. Sometimes it might scream and yell. Sometimes it might act more competent. And behind the driver is a process in your personality that has the development of about a 3-year-old. It's very unpredictable how it shows up for you. Sometimes it, in your personality, screams and rants and raves and throws temper tantrums or whatever the equivalent for you would be. At other times, it can actually be helpful to you. It can almost get you in touch with the childlike parts of you. Maybe the things you aspire to do, those imaginative things in the world that you want to do with your life that are very childlike. They're small-minded in that they're imaginative and they're exciting for you, and they're the little parts of you that are fun, and the qualities of you that capture that innocence or that essence of being a child with all the hopes and dreams you could possibly have. And so this part of you, again, is the development level of a 3-year-old, and this is where is very much like the driver, this is also going to be unconscious for you. It's something you're not going to necessarily be a lot aware of in your life. In fact, we've noticed in our profiler training course, and when we talk to people and coach people, when we explain this part of them, if we explain it well, most people, when you explain their 3-year-old to them well, they almost have an aversion to it. It almost feels icky to them because it's a part of them that's so unconscious that they almost feel like, ooh, I don't know if I like that. If that's part of my personality, I'm not sure I want that to be part of my personality, because it's the exact opposite of the driver. The way you see the world and engage with the world at the driver level, this is the opposite of that. So of course you're going to have almost an aversion to it, or almost a part of you that's like, ooh, I don't want to see this aspect of me. And yet it still is a part of your personality. It's something that impacts you every day, whether you know it or not. And it's something that needs attention on a regular basis, because just like if you're driving a real car down the freeway and you have a 3-year-old toddler in the back, for a while that toddler might be able to entertain themselves. Maybe just look out the window or sleep or eat some Cheerios or whatever they're doing in the back seat behind you. But eventually they might get tired. They might wake up for their nap. They might, go to the bathroom in their diaper, need some attention if they're still wearing diapers at 3. I guess a lot of people aren't at 3, but whatever. They might need some attention. They might have to go to the bathroom. And now you have an issue on your hands where you need to give attention to that 3-year-old in the back seat of your car. This works the same in your personality.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that we do have a weird push-pull relationship with that 3-year-old, because when we experience the part of our personality and it's negative, like it has a lot of needs and it's screaming in the back, and we give it a bunch of attention, but we weren't proactive about it. Let's say that we are very reactionary to when our 3-year-old needs attention. These are moments that Naomi Quink in her book, Is That Really Me? Or Was That Really Me? Would call being in the grip, or that's kind of what it's technically called, is a grip experience. And so when we go to that place, we feel like sometimes the result is embarrassment, or sometimes the result is like, oh, that didn't feel good because that didn't feel like how I normally show up or behave. But then at other times, when we are proactively giving it attention and we can enjoy it, just like when you enjoy a 3-year-old and they're in a time of play or imagination or a time of seriousness or whatever it is, but you as an adult are really engaged with that 3-year-old, it can be quite lovely and it can be a fun experience. It doesn't have to all be bad news. It can actually be something that you work are attracted to or attracted toward. And these are moments when we call the 3-year-old your aspiration. These are the times when there's like a voice that whispers in the, sort of behind your head, in your ear, that tells you that something else needs addressing, something else needs attention. And because it's the polarity opposite of your driver process, which is what oftentimes helps set the frame for your life, this is the part of you that you kind of feel like you've been neglecting to your own detriment. And then when you start to balance or integrate this part of who you are, then you get a bigger picture of things, of your own personal needs and wants, maybe things that you've been suppressing for a long time because it didn't feel like you. But when you turn it into a proactive engagement, as opposed to simply reactive where, oh crap, now the kid is screaming and what do I do, right? And that always feels bad, Nikki. But then when you are checking in with your 3-year-old, making sure they're okay, they feel well nourished, they feel like they've got some attention from you, then it can be a very positive experience. And again, like you mentioned, 3-year-olds are untouched by cynicism. And so that part of you is the part of you that is untouched by cynicism usually. Now, there can be a lot of pain in that part of who you are as well. If you've gone through a very difficult time period throughout your life and you have a lot of healing work, sometimes we shovel it over to the 3-year-old because we know we can ignore it for a long time. So sometimes it's not all fun and games, because when we go to that place, we realize we have a lot of unresolved issues that we have to work out. And then in that case, oftentimes it's not just the 3-year-old that's harboring those issues. It's actually issues that are in the attitude that you're less familiar with or isn't as native to you. And then in those cases, because the 3-year-old is in the same attitude, introverted or extroverted attitude as the Copilot, in those situations, as opposed to neglecting the 3-year-old thinking that's where all your wounding is, one of the best things you can do is you can allow your Copilot, which if you've been exercising your Copilot, is now not just a 2-dimensional person, but is actually a fleshed out, well-developed human being, right? Well-developed problem-solving person. You can take some of those unresolved issues and then have the Copilot help you manage them, because we have a tendency to shove the stuff we don't want to see in cabinets that we can ignore. And if we're an extrovert, we'll oftentimes shove those things we don't like into introverted cabinets. And if we're an introvert, we'll shove those things into extroverted cabinets. And so if you find yourself in the 3-year-old, if you find yourself going to the 3-year-old proactively, but then there's a bunch of stuff in there that you didn't want to really see, then my recommendation is to allow your Copilot that you've been developing, hand those off to that Copilot, because they're in a much, much better space to help you, sort through that work that might be trauma and need some healing, or could just simply be, questions of self-esteem that need a little bit of achievement, or whatever it is. Hand them over to the Copilot process that is more equipped to take care of them, and allow your 3-year-old to be a 3-year-old. Allow it to be something that you have a fragile but loving relationship with, and that you allow to be continue to be untouched by cynicism, and allow it to be part of your aspiration or the thing that helps fuel your bigger dreams and big game plans.
So we've talked about the car model, and I'd like to give you a quick framework to determine which cognitive functions you're using based on your personality type. This is a little technical, but I think you can follow along. And we have a lot of writing and material about this on our website. We've done some webinars about it, but I think the conversation about the car model will be complete when we give you the piece of how to take your 4-letter code and determine which cognitive functions you're using in your specific car for your personality type. Again, you can go and listen to the podcast about your personality type and get the specifics of how this is showing up for you and all the nuances of it. But I'm going to give you a framework right now in order to determine on your own how to discover which cognitive functions you're using. So we start with the 4-letter code. So whatever that is, ENTP, ISFJ, whatever your 4-letter code is. You've taken a test somewhere, you know what your 4-letter code is. I want you to imagine this 4-letter code almost like a sandwich. The first letter is a slice of bread. The 2 middle letters is the meat of the sandwich. And the last letter is another slice of bread. So let's go ahead and just not focus on the 2 slices of bread right now. Let's focus in the middle of the sandwich. So at the second letter position in the meat of the sandwich is going to be either an S or an N. S stands for sensing. N stands for intuition. The reason why it's an N is because you have an I for introvert extrovert. You don't have the same letter there to replicate. So N is the second letter in intuition. So that's why we have an N there. So sensing or intuition. This is how you perceive the world. This is how you take in information. This is how you learn. This is how you show up and you see your world using either sensing or intuition. The next letter is going to either be a T or an F. T stands for thinking. F stands for feeling. This is how you judge the information or the world that you've perceived. This is how you make evaluative or judgment calls. You judge the information. You make decisions using either feeling or thinking. So obviously you're going to have one or the other in each of these 2 positions. So that's the meat of the sandwich. So let's just go ahead and pick 2 random ones just to give a sense of this. Let's go ahead and say you have an S and an F in that sandwich there. Let's say you're using sensing to perceive your world, and you're using feeling to judge or evaluate the criteria that you're sensing in the world. So now that last letter, let's go ahead and add that next. So the 4th letter in your dichotomies, basically, that you're working with. It's going to be either a P for perceiver or J for judger. And this letter is very critical because basically what this letter tells you is which of those 2 middle letters you're showing the outside world. Which one of those letters are you extroverting and other people are able to see? So if you are a P, if you're a perceiver, that means you are extroverting or you're showing the outer world your perceiving process or your perceiving part of your personality, basically. So that means that that second letter is what you're showing the world. If it is a J and you're a judger, that means you're showing the world decision making. You're showing the world either thinking or feeling. So in this, the SF, let's say it's a J is the last letter. That means you're showing the world judgment. You're showing the world how you're making decisions. You're extroverting the judging part of you. So what we do at this point then, again, if you're a judger in the Myers-Briggs system, if you're extroverting that judging part of you or the decision-making part of you, that F, we'd put a little E next to that F. And that means that you're using extroverted feeling in the outer world. You're extroverting your feeling in the world, and that's what people see of you. By definition, then, that means you're automatically introverting your perceiving process. So we put a little I next to that. So introverted sensing is how we would say that out loud. So now you have these 2, again, imagine this. I'm going very quick here, so follow along if you can. You have these 2 middle letters that now we have what's technically called attitudes attached to them. One of those middle letters has an introverted attitude attached to it. One of those letters has an extroverted attitude attached to it. And remember when Antonia talked about our personalities have to do 4 things: engage with the inner world, engage with the outer world, make decisions, and perceive or learn information. So now these 2 letters have covered all 4 bases. We have introverted sensing, which is the introverted attitude, and sensing, so it's perceiving or taking information. And we have extroverted feeling, which is an extroverted attitude and making decisions or judging the information we're taking in through feeling. So now all 4 bases are covered. So those are actually cognitive functions we just talked about. Introverted sensing, we've nicknamed it memory. Extroverted feeling, we've nicknamed harmony. Those are 2 cognitive functions in your personality. And those are the two cognitive functions. If you are SFJ, you will show up using as your primary cognitive functions. Now, we didn't talk about that first letter, that first slice of bread, which is either going to be introverted or extroverted. And we've already determined which one of your cognitive functions is introverted or extroverted. So where does this letter come in, that first letter? Why is that important? This letter tells you which order those two cognitive functions are. So, for example, the introverted sensing, the extroverted feeling, let's say you are an ISFJ. The I stands for introvert, and that means you will favor the introverted cognitive function. So introverted sensing. So on your car model, if you're drawing out the 4 quadrants on your car model, introverted sensing would go into the driver of the car model. And then automatically extroverted feeling would be the co-pilot. If you were an ESFJ, those would be switched. The extroverted function, which would be extroverted feeling, would be in the driver's seat. And introverted sensing would be in the co-pilot seat. And then from there, all you have to know is what is attached to those. Remember, it's the polar opposite. To find the 10-year-old, let's again say if you're an ESFJ, the driver would be extroverted feeling, meaning the 3-year-old directly behind the driver would be introverted thinking. And the co-pilot is introverted sensing, meaning the 10-year-old would be extroverted intuition. And you can do this for all the cognitive functions. You can basically take that 4-letter code, you separate the 2 letters in the middle. Is it a judger or perceiver, a J or P? Which one are you extroverting to the world? So if it's a P, perceiver, you'd put a little E next to the perceiving letter, which is that second letter. If it's a J or judger, you put an E next to the judging letter, or the T or the F in the third position. And then the other one would be the opposite of that. And then you can find out which order they go into your car, which is the driver process, based on that first letter of introvert or extrovert. This is basically how you discover or find which cognitive functions you're using in your personality, taking all 4 letters and then reverse engineering from there to find your cognitive function stack or the car model stack.
Okay, so now you have all the intel.
That was a lot.
That was a lot. This is a very technical episode. So now you know how to figure out your cognitive function stack from your 4-letter code. And you know how to place them in the car model, and you know the dynamics of how all of these positions work. So you have officially mastered the Myers-Briggs Cognitive Function 101 course, and you did quite well, I imagine. Now, if you know all this information, this may have been a review for you. If you are brand new to this whole system, hopefully this was helpful for you to break all of this information down. And when we start up our Profire training course, which we do at different times of the year, then oftentimes we'll host a webinar and we break all this down using some visual components. But if you're just a podcast listener and that's all you plan on being, hopefully this helped you fillet out a bit of the system that can be a little complicated sometimes. And this is the barrier of entry for a lot of people graduating from the 4-function or 4-letter code into cognitive functions. And so if you don't care and you just want us to do the work for you, go find the podcast where we talk about your personality type and we do all the work for you. We talk about what your 4 functions are and how they show up in your personality type and a little bit about how those dynamics work.
Yeah, there's entire resource pages on our website with all the different podcasts we recorded for each type, and that's on that list of different resources for your type. And it's really powerful. In fact, we don't just do the work for you to help you or to find your cognitive functions. We talk a lot about the growth strategies, some of the challenges you might have, some of the defenses you might have in your personality. It's a wealth of information, I think, is very helpful for you to really learn how to grow yourself and understand yourself and how you're interfacing with everybody else. The other thing I want to say about this too is, again, this podcast can be very highly technical and you're like, there's a lot of information to process, especially if you're new to this. It does get easier because the patterns, there's patterns that emerge from here. It's not like every single time you have to reverse engineer things and think this carefully about it. Once you get the pattern, you start to see how much faster you can find cognitive functions based on anyone's type. So just understand, it's like anything you learn. When you learn it and you get the pattern down, it goes much faster and you can apply it much faster and you can see how other things interplay with it. So I just want to encourage you that as you're learning this, it gets easier as you spend more time with the material. So now it's your turn to come over to personalityhacker.com and tell us your story, leave a comment, ask a question, be involved in the community, be involved in this conversation. It's been Antonia and myself up till now, but now your voice is needed. We'd like your voice to be represented. At personalityhacker.com, you can comment or ask a question directly below this podcast, and that's a great place to get started. So come over and do that today, and let's get a conversation going around the CAR model and how to use it in your life.
And it's really good for you to know what Copilot process you're using, because we're about to launch into a whole series of podcasts on developing your Copilot. So one of the reasons why we wanted to start with this podcast is just in case you don't know what the Copilot is for your personality type, that's a good thing to figure out as soon as possible. So when we launch into this short series of different ways to develop that Copilot, which we believe is one of the most important strategies you can do for growth using the Myers-Briggs typology system, figure out your Copilot, because we're about to tell you what you can do to move the needle on your personality type. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you're wondering how to support Personality Hacker, if that's something that's interesting to you, we recommend you head over to personalityhacker.com and look at our program catalog. If there is a match for you in personal development or simply in learning more information around how some of these systems work, give our products a try, our premium products, and find out if one is right for you. And that's one of the best ways you can support the work that we're doing here at Personality Hacker.
And we believe that this would be a great thing to introduce to a friend, someone that's an enthusiast, someone that would like to know more about this. We really create this podcast to help people understand more about themselves, to grow themselves, to be able to make an impact in their world. So would you introduce us to a friend or family member that you think would really resonate with what we talk about here on this podcast? I think it'd be a powerful thing. And then now you've got a friend or a family member to talk about some of the issues or some of the things that we talk about here on the podcast. You can bounce ideas off each other and have real life conversations with other people that you know, like, and trust already. So introduce us to a friend or family member. We love to be a part of their experience and your experience together collectively. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.